hear footsteps above me, but this house only has one floor. The man who let me in is standing in the doorway, watching me in complete darkness. Something is terribly wrong here, and I'm about to find out just how wrong things can get. I moved to Montana about 4 years ago, settling into a remote house where the nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away. I preferred the isolation. For 3 years, everything was peaceful. Then came that February afternoon when everything changed. I was finishing up work when the snow started falling. Within an hour, it had turned into something dangerous. My boss sent everyone home before the roads became impassable. My lifted truck handled the drive well enough, but when I reached my house, I discovered my front door was frozen solid. The lock mechanism wouldn't budge no matter what I tried. With the storm intensifying and my truck already half buried in snow, I had no choice but to walk to the nearest house for help. The closest place was a small, rundown house about a quarter-mile away. When I knocked, the door swung open so violently I stepped back. The man standing there was around 50 with forgettable features. He introduced himself as Marcus and let me inside after I explained my situation. That's when things started feeling wrong. Marcus couldn't focus on anything. His eyes darted constantly around the room, from me to the walls to the ceiling. He'd start sentences and trail off, staring at spots on the wall like he was looking through them. When I asked to sleep on his couch, he seemed relieved and quickly turned off the lights. But instead of leaving, he just stood in the doorway for a full minute, not moving or speaking. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I'd jolt awake. Then I started hearing sounds from above, thumping and scraping noises coming from the ceiling. But this was a one-story house. There was no upstairs. The sounds continued for several minutes, then came a thump so loud I shot up on the couch. That's when I saw Marcus standing in the doorway again, watching me in the dark. Before I could speak, he charged at me. He jumped over the couch and tackled me to the floor. We rolled around as he tried to put me in a chokehold. He was stronger than he looked. While we fought, he kept screaming about her and how she was lonely and would find me good company. I finally managed to shove him off and ran for the door without even putting on my coat. Behind me, he screamed something about how she's not going to be happy. I ran through the blizzard until I reached another house. The family there, Robert and Lisa, took me in immediately. The next morning, as soon as I described the house, Robert interrupted me. He knew exactly who I was talking about. Robert told me that Marcus had been a problem for years. About a decade earlier, his wife had disappeared. There was never an official investigation, but most locals suspected he had killed her. The body was never found. I reported everything to the police, but nothing came of it. The terrifying part is that I still live in the same house. Every time I drive past Marcus's place, I get that same unsettling feeling, wondering what he did to his wife and what he planned to do to me. You never really know how quickly a normal evening can turn into a nightmare. One minute you're watching television, the next you're fighting for your life. That's exactly what happened to me last winter during one of the worst blizzards Vermont had seen in years. I'm 28 and live alone in a small rental house. I work remotely in finance, which means I rarely leave the house during winter weeks. The local news had been warning about this particular storm for days, calling it potentially historic. I stocked up on groceries that morning and settled in for what I thought would be a boring few days indoors. The snow started around 3 in the afternoon. By 9 o'clock, I could barely see past my front porch. The wind was constant, like the house was trapped inside a tunnel. Around 11:30, I heard a thud followed by a dragging sound. I figured a tree branch had fallen. 15 minutes later, I heard a weak car horn, intermittent and strange. Looking out my front window, I saw headlights near the end of my driveway. A vehicle was stopped there, but I couldn't make out any movement through the storm. I assumed someone had slid off the road. With visibility so poor, I decided to stay inside rather than risk my life for a stranger. At midnight, someone knocked on my front door. I called out, asking who was there. A man's voice answered, saying his car was stuck and he needed to come inside to warm up and use a phone. His voice sounded strained, out of breath. Part of me felt guilty, but I wasn't ready to open my door to a stranger in the middle of the night. I cracked the door, keeping the security chain locked. The man was covered in snow, caked on his jacket, shoulders, and hair. He was shorter than me and visibly shivering. He said his phone had died and he'd been walking for some time looking for a house with lights on. I was about to open the door when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. His boots were completely clean and dry. If this man had really been walking through a blizzard, his boots should have been caked with snow and ice. Mine get like that just walking to my car. Something was very wrong. I told him I would call for help and close the door. I heard him say something, but I was already reaching for my phone. While I was on the line with 911, I heard footsteps move from my porch toward the back of my house. The operator told me to stay inside and keep all doors locked. Police were being dispatched, but response times would be delayed because of the weather. I moved to a side window and looked out. The man was standing near the corner of my house, maybe 15 feet away. He wasn't moving, just standing there looking up at the windows. A few minutes later, I heard violent banging on my back door. Someone was trying to break through. The whole door shook in its frame. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. The banging stopped after about a minute. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. Then I heard that car horn again, one long continuous honk. The police arrived shortly after. They found a vehicle partially buried in a snowbank, but it was further down the road than where I'd seen the headlights. The engine was cold when they checked it, not warm like it would have been if someone had recently been driving it. Here's what still haunts me. The officers said there were no footprints leading from the vehicle to my house. The snow was undisturbed between the car and my property. There were footsteps leading down my driveway and around my house, but they stopped at the driveway like someone had arrived in a separate car. The police searched the area but found no one. The next morning, after the storm passed, I went outside to look around. There were muddy handprints on the exterior of my bedroom window that hadn't been there when police searched the property. It was like the person had returned after they left, or had been hiding somewhere the entire time. A few days later, I learned that another house about half a mile away had been broken into during the storm. The homeowner wasn't there, so no one was hurt. The strange part was that nothing was stolen. Whoever broke in didn't take anything. Why would someone break into a house during a blizzard and steal nothing? It's almost like they weren't there to rob the place, but to do something else entirely. I'm just glad I didn't open that door. Sometimes the most terrifying encounters happen when you're completely isolated, miles from civilization, with no way to call for help. That's exactly the situation I found myself in several years ago on a mountain in Alberta. What happened up there still doesn't make sense, and I've accepted that it probably never will. I'm 35 now, but for most of my 20s, I was a professional skier. Alpine racing mostly, competing nationally for about 7 years before my body told me it was time to stop. Nothing dramatic like a career-ending injury, just the accumulated wear and tear from throwing myself down mountains since childhood. I retired from competition at 27, but that didn't mean I stopped skiing. If anything, it freed me up to do the kind of skiing I actually loved. Backcountry adventures away from resorts and crowds. I say this not to impress anyone, but to establish that I knew what I was doing out there. I was avalanche trained, certified in wilderness first aid, and familiar with every protocol for solo backcountry skiing. I'd done dozens of solo trips without incident. The plan that day was simple. Hit a remote range a few hours north of where I lived, a spot I'd skied before. The weather forecast called for light snowfall, maybe a few inches. Nothing concerning. I checked avalanche conditions the night before, and again that morning. Everything looked manageable. I reached the mountain just after sunrise, strapped on my gear, and started skinning uphill. The snowfall started picking up while I was climbing, which wasn't unusual, but the wind had changed direction and was stronger than predicted. Visibility was dropping much faster than I was comfortable with. The smart move would have been to turn around immediately, but I was already at the top of a line I'd been anticipating all week. I told myself just one run and then I'd call it early. I've replayed that decision 1,000 times since. I know experienced people die in the backcountry because they make exactly the kind of call I made that day. I knew it then too, but I did it anyway. The descent started fine. The pitch was manageable and I was skiing conservatively. About 2/3 of the way down, the worst possible thing happened. If you've never been caught in an avalanche, it's hard to describe how fast it occurs. 1 second you're in control, the next you're not. The snow moves and you have no choice but to move with it. I got lucky. The avalanche wasn't massive, probably a class 2, enough to knock me off my skis but not enough to bury me. I tumbled maybe 30 or 40 yards before slamming into something solid. The impact was instant deceleration. I don't know what it was, rocks probably, or maybe a tree buried under the snowpack. All I remember is the feeling in my left leg. I tried to convince myself everything was fine, but it wasn't. My skis had released, which was good, but one had tumbled further downhill and I had no idea where it ended up. I tried to stand and immediately collapsed. The pain in my leg was unimaginable. I managed to get into a sitting position and assessed the situation. The snow was getting worse, which meant I was likely experiencing the opening moments of a blizzard. My options were limited. I could stay where I was and hope someone came looking, But only one person knew where I was that day and wouldn't assume something was wrong for hours. I could try to dig in and wait out the storm, but I didn't have supplies for an overnight and the temperature was dropping. Or I could start moving, painfully and slowly, trying to cover as much ground as possible before conditions worsened. I chose to move. I secured what was left of my gear and started limping downhill, using my remaining pole as a makeshift crutch. Every step sent agony through my leg, but I had to keep moving. The snow was falling so heavily I could barely see. I was focusing on ignoring the pain and wondering if I was going to die out there when I heard something behind me. At first, I thought adrenaline was affecting my brain. That was genuinely my first thought, that I was becoming delirious. But I turned around anyway, and what I saw filled me with an emotion that has no word. There was another skier moving downhill toward me. Seeing him emerging from the snow filled me with simultaneous relief and inexplicable fear. He reached me within minutes. He was alone and a backcountry equipped like me. He pulled off his helmet to readjust his goggles and asked if I was hurt. I explained what happened. Without wasting a second, he moved to my side and let me put my arm around his shoulder. We started moving together. I felt something I couldn't explain beyond the adrenaline, pain, relief, and confusion. It didn't feel like a normal interaction. It felt like he hadn't stumbled upon me by accident, as impossible as that sounds. We talked about basic things, most of which I don't remember, but there was one thing he said that stayed with me. He told me he hadn't used his legs in a long time, and it was nice to get back on solid ground. I didn't know what he meant by that. I assumed he was using some ski terminology I didn't recognize. I laughed and we kept going. At one point, I had to stop. I remember this moment like it was yesterday. I leaned against a tree and closed my eyes for literally 4 seconds. When I opened them, he was gone. There was no one there. Unless he had buried himself in the snow, there was nowhere for anyone to go. I yelled for him, but no one called back. I started looking around, thinking maybe he had gotten buried. Nothing. It gets worse, though. There were no tracks in the snow other than my own. I started panicking. He'd been right there, supporting half my weight for what must have been an hour, but there was nothing. The rational part of my brain insisted there had to be an explanation. Maybe I was more disoriented than I thought. Maybe the snow had filled in his tracks faster than mine. Or maybe I had hallucinated the whole thing. Maybe I was already dead. I didn't have time to figure it out. The storm wasn't going to wait for me to process what had happened. I don't know how I made it back to my car. The last mile was such a blur of pain and cold and stubborn refusal to stop moving. But I eventually made it. I drove myself to the hospital where they told me my leg was severely sprained, but not broken. They said I got incredibly lucky. A few days later, while recovering at home, I couldn't stop thinking about that other skier. Where he'd come from, where he'd gone, why there hadn't been any tracks. I was browsing local skiing websites when I stumbled upon something that made my blood freeze. It was a story about a fatal backcountry skiing incident. A man who'd been lost in a storm a few weeks prior on the same mountain range. Authorities hadn't been able to find a body. There were no photographs in the article, and when I searched his name, I found no social media profiles. So I can't compare the man I saw on the mountain to the man in the article, but it's still a chilling coincidence. I choose to believe shock and hypothermia were causing me to hallucinate, that my memory was playing tricks on me. But I remember his shoulder under my arm. I remember feeling him helping me down the mountain. There's no way I could have moved that fast by myself. I still ski, but I haven't gone alone since then. I still have no idea what helped me off that mountain that day, and I'm not sure I want to know. I keep telling myself there has to be a logical explanation, but deep down, I know something impossible happened on that mountain. Something that saved my life when I should have died alone in that storm. The strangest part isn't even the disappearing tracks or the sudden vanishing. It's what he said about not using his legs in a long time. At the time, I thought it was just ski talk I didn't understand. Now, thinking about that missing skier who never made it home, those words take on a completely different meaning. What if he really hadn't used his legs in weeks because he couldn't anymore? What if whatever was left of him somehow found me when I needed help the most? I've tried researching similar incidents, looking for other stories of mysterious rescues in the backcountry. What I found disturbed me more than I expected. There are dozens of accounts from all over the world. Hikers pulled from avalanches by strangers who disappear without a trace. Climbers guided to safety by people who leave no footprints. Lost skiers who swear someone helped them navigate through whiteout conditions, only to find themselves completely alone when the storm clears. The common thread in all these stories is the same. People who should have died alone somehow make it to safety with help from someone who couldn't possibly have been there. And in almost every case, there's a recent death in the same area. Someone who went missing and was never found. I don't talk about this anymore. When people ask how I made it off the mountain with a busted leg in those conditions, I tell them I got lucky. I tell them adrenaline is a powerful thing. I tell them anything except the truth, because the truth sounds insane even to me. But late at night, when the wind picks up outside my house, I sometimes wonder if I'm the only one who's experienced something like this. I wonder how many people have been saved by someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The thing that haunts me most isn't the mystery of who helped me. It's the possibility that someday, when another skier is lost and dying in those same mountains, maybe I'll be the one who appears to help them down. Maybe that's how it works. Maybe that's the price of being saved when you should have died. Maybe we all become part of something larger, something that watches over the mountains and helps the lost find their way home. I still feel him sometimes, that presence on my shoulder, supporting my weight as we moved through the storm together. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I can hear his voice carried on the wind, telling other lost souls that everything will be okay, that help is coming, that they're not alone up there in the cold and the dark. The mountains remember everything. Every person who's ever been lost, every soul who's ever needed help, every moment when someone should have died but didn't. And maybe, just maybe, they give back when they can. Maybe that's what saved me that day. Not a hallucination or a delusion brought on by pain and cold, but something much older and more mysterious than I could ever understand. I keep my backcountry gear ready now, always prepared for a rescue call that might come in the middle of the night, because I have a feeling that someday it will be my turn to appear out of nowhere when someone needs help the most. And when that day comes, I'll be ready to pay forward the impossible kindness that saved my life on that mountain. The debt I owe can never really be repaid, but maybe it can be passed on to the next person who finds themselves alone and dying in the wilderness, wondering if anyone will ever find them. Maybe that's how these things work. Maybe that's how they've always worked. The mountains take care of their own, one impossible rescue at a time. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes they share their mercy with those who need it most. That's what I choose to believe anyway. Because the alternative is accepting that I survived something impossible, and I'm not ready to face that reality just yet. But there's one more thing I need to tell you about that day. Something I've never shared with anyone, not even my wife. When I finally made it back to my car and was sitting there in the driver's seat, shaking from cold and adrenaline, I found something in my jacket pocket that hadn't been there before. It was a small piece of paper, folded twice, with something written on it in pencil. The handwriting was barely legible, smudged by moisture, but I could make out the words, "Thank you for letting me help." That's when I knew, beyond any doubt, that what happened on that mountain was real. Someone had been there with me, had helped me down that slope, had saved my life. And somehow, in those few seconds when I closed my eyes against that tree, he had managed to slip that note into my pocket before disappearing forever. I still have that piece of paper. It's tucked away in my wallet, yellowed and fragile now, but I carry it everywhere I go. It's my reminder that there are forces in this world we don't understand, kindnesses that can't be explained, and sometimes, when we need it most, help comes from the most unexpected places. The strangest part is that I'm not afraid of it anymore. That presence I felt, that impossible rescue, it wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be grateful for. Someone who couldn't save himself had found a way to save me instead. And in doing so, he had given both of us something precious. The chance to matter, to make a difference, to ensure that not everyone who gets lost stays lost forever. I think about him sometimes when I'm out on the slopes, especially on days when the weather turns bad and visibility drops. I wonder if he's still out there, still helping people find their way home. I hope he is. I hope he's found some kind of peace in being able to give back, to turn his tragedy into someone else's salvation. The mountains are dangerous places, full of hidden crevasses and sudden storms and 1,000 ways to die. But they're also places of incredible beauty and unexpected grace. They test us, push us to our limits, and sometimes they break us. But occasionally, if we're very lucky, they also save us. Not through our own skill or preparation or luck, but through the intervention of something we can't see or understand. That's what happened to me that day. I was saved by a ghost, by a spirit, by a man who had died weeks earlier, but somehow found the strength to help one more person make it home safely. And now, every time I strap on my skis and head into the backcountry, I carry that knowledge with me like a talisman. I'm not alone out there. None of us are. The mountains are full of watchers, guardians who have chosen to stay behind and help the living navigate the same treacherous terrain that claimed their lives. They ask for nothing in return except the chance to matter one more time, to ensure that their deaths weren't completely meaningless, So when you're out there in the wilderness, whether you're skiing or hiking or just trying to find your way back to civilization, remember that you're not alone. Help might come from the most unexpected places, in forms you never imagined possible. And if you're very lucky, if you really need it, someone who should be gone might appear out of nowhere to make sure you make it home safely. That's the truth I've learned to live with. That's the story I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. And that's why I still ski alone sometimes, despite everything that happened, because I know now that I'm never really alone up there. Someone is always watching, always ready to help if the situation becomes desperate enough. The debt can never be fully repaid, but it can be honored. Every safe descent, every successful rescue, every moment when someone chooses to help a stranger in need is a small payment on that infinite obligation. We're all connected out there in the wilderness, the living and the dead, bound together by the understanding that survival sometimes requires the impossible, and sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible happens.